All right, welcome to part 2 of a webinar series that's tied specifically to bad surveys that businesses and individuals may not be aware that they're pulling together for organizations. This one is specifically tied to question types. And when I say question types, this is 1 point out of 100 that we're going to touch on this entire series of potential pitfalls people may be falling into. This one goes specifically into measuring consumer sentiment. And when I say sentiment, that's really about what people's thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are. Now, if you haven't watched the introductory to the webinar series, I recommend that you go back and watch it. If not, I'm going to do a real quick recap of that series on these next couple of slides here. First of all, our goal of this entire series is about enlightenment, and it's about understanding these potential pitfalls and their implications when you're conducting customer surveys. But most importantly, we're going to try to show you a better way moving forward. So who and what we are, CraniumTap is a marketing research firm. We're more founded on grounded principles and understanding marketing and research, and those things tie together, being more efficient. But we're not like the other guys, as you're going to see. And then myself, I'm Adam Cook. I've been in marketing research for 20 years. I've been lucky enough to have some international recognition. I've got published methods, I've got certifications. And then we touched on in the original introductory to the webinar series, right now businesses are going through a lot. Again, that's an understatement of the century, but they are, there's this combination of looking at short-term challenges and then the long-term challenges. And part of that, organizations are starting to reach out and conduct surveys with their customer bases or with their markets, and they're starting to fall into a lot of these pitfalls that we're going to touch on, and today specifically with question types. And in the intro, we talked about this entire series as we release it in totality is really about, it's a little bit of tying into the old matrix model of taking a red pill or a blue pill. If you continue to watch, we're going to reveal what's behind the curtain, show you what's going on. These are things you probably haven't given much thought to, but we're going to give you the whole truth, all of it. And with that, it's always that reminder of, since I myself and the people I work with at CraniumTap have had a lot of years of experience working in marketing research, these pitfalls and challenges are not your fault. It's a lot of organizations are tasked with creating their own surveys, or they give that charge to their marketing department, and then sometimes they reach out to consulting firms or marketing research firms. And these different areas or these different touch points and decision makers who are working on these research topics, they may fall into these pitfalls, but again, it's just, if you haven't done a lot of work in it, you just may not be aware. That's what this series is all about though. One of the key points we touched on in the introduction was when developing customer surveys is 3 key elements to creating a successful survey, one being the user experience. That's the most important element. Without a good user experience, it's hard to get great data and it's hard to make better business decisions. Number 2 is creating a survey that's going to give you the most actionable insights possible. That speaks for itself. It's obviously tied into the user experience, but its outcome helps give a more positive impact on your brand when it comes to developing and implementing marketing solutions or business solutions, period. And your brand itself is impacted. It's, when you start talking about delivering a survey to customers, that's brand interaction. You want to make sure you optimize that experience and reflect your brand the best you can. At the same time, if you're not getting actionable data, it's hard to have a positive brand outcome. And then there's a number of contributing factors to those three keys, which is a big part of this webinar series, and us touching on the invites that you send to customers, the general language you use, the survey design itself in totality, and then when we start talking about things like question language, question types, which we're going to specifically dive deep into today, as well as the design types that you use in questions. And then lastly, the analytical approaches that you use. Today, we're going to touch on effectively measuring consumer sentiment. I'll get into specifics on that in a second. But what you're going to see today in the examples that we share are really touching on the user experience and the actionable insights that you garner using different question types. I don't want to downplay it, but we do know both of these impact your brand in terms of the insights that you give and the interactions that you offer to your customers. So what do we mean when we're saying sentiment? You heard me touch on it a little bit before. It really runs a wide spectrum of different things. There's the yes/no world, and there are things you are or not. But then there's more complex things like feelings or values and beliefs. Whether or not I agree to a certain degree to certain things, how much I like or dislike things, my interest level, preferences. There's a long list of different things. And with that, it really presents a possible dilemma, and that being humans being the most frustrating, because they're not always that simple when it comes to their decisions. There's that proverbial, choice that you have in the road. There's a fork in the road. There's the basic question: do you go left or do you go right? But there's also, in this instance, should I take a seat on the bench? I could turn back. Is that an option I'm thinking about? Then there are questions like, how do I feel about the left option, or how do I feel about the right option? Well, how do I feel about taking a rest on the bench? Then there's even things like, how likely am I to choose one of these options over the other? How much am I considering these options available? And how do I feel about these options in different times of the year? So you can see that list can just keep going on and on and on. And what's valuable in marketing research isn't always just about understanding the yes or the no. In this instance, the left or the right. It's getting deeper and understanding motives is going to be more valuable in the insights that you collect. And then honestly, you're going to see through our examples, there's some differences too in the way you ask questions and how that impacts the user experience. Today, we're going to touch on 7 specific different types of questions that you could be using to get at these different types of consumer sentiment. Let's get into the simplest one, which is what we're calling single selection. Now, when we start talking about single selection, it's really about I have one choice and I can only make one choice when we're looking at that. That's going to have implications on the broader picture about customers or the market that you're looking at in terms of their sentiment. Let's take a look at an example. We're using an example about going to a pizza restaurant in terms of which of the following options do you consider the most important when you're considering a pizza from a specific restaurant? And they're given roughly about a dozen different options here to choose from. Now in single selection, me as a user, and we're looking at this through the user lens initially, one of the biggest prevailing challenges is I'm only allowed to pick one. And reality is there may be more than one thing that's really important to me as a user when I'm looking at this survey, but I've been forced to only pick one. And that almost assumes that anything else that I don't choose isn't important to me, which obviously has implications on the actionable insights. Because traditionally, you get a question like that and you get the data back, you're just going to look at it in percentages of that customer base that selected those different options. But you already heard me hint at the user experience impacting the results on this type of question. It's sort of that all or none mentality. It basically assumes the one I picked was definitely the most important, but it sort of assumes that the rest were not important to me, which can be problematic when you're looking at the data. So you see the rank order, it just assumes that, when you see something like pizza types, it only had 4.44% that selected, that it is one of the least important things to people. But we don't know that because people were only allowed to select one thing. So it doesn't really capture the full complexity of how people are making their decisions. And this is at its simplest when we're talking about single selection questions. Then that moves us to the option of multi-select option, where a question that's presented and I can select multiple things. This starts to widen the options, but it presents different challenges as you're going to see. So here, we're going to look at it through the lens of the user experience. Now we're changing the question, which of the following options do you consider the most important when you're considering pizza from a restaurant? And then there's the option to select all that you feel that apply to you. Obviously, this looks like it has better value than the first option, because now as a user, it's like I can select multiple things. I'm not just bound to one thing anymore. The problem is, as you look at it, what are the cutoffs for individuals, one, and also there's no delineating when I selected, in this example, you can see 5 different things selected. well, were those all equal in value? Were they different? Was one significantly higher than the other? We don't know, unfortunately, when we look at it. But the same thing goes for each individual who's presented with this. They're going to create their own unique cutoffs for what they're going to include for answers. And then that impacts the analysis on actionable insights. So again, we see a chart. We're going to be able to look at the percent that's selected. And obviously, it doesn't add up to 100 because you can select multiple options on the list there from the customers. But again, it gives a perception that something that's highest on the list is the most valued, when in reality, it's something like speedy delivery or in-store service, which was number one in the data. It could have been somewhere in the middle point, but it just happened to be something people selected multiple times. It was just, it could have been number 2 or 3 on everyone's list, but it showed up as the highest in terms of being selected. That produces what we call a potential false positive in this instance. Or then there's the other end of the scale of potential false negatives, just simply because it wasn't selected enough. It's assumed that it wasn't important at all. That moves us to another question type, which is creating a range or context around how many people can select in that type of multi-select issue. In that multi-select question. So the example, we're just shifting it a little bit. Now it's please select the top 3 options that are most important to you when you're considering pizza from a restaurant. And then, the users can only select 3. It's almost a bit of a hybrid between single select, which binds me to only selecting 1, multi-select, which has no boundaries, but here it's almost somewhere in between. And we put top X because it could be your pick 3, pick 4, pick 5, depending on the list that you're doing on an analysis. But the prevailing issues, again, it's believe it or not, now it's a mixture of single selection and multi-selection for the user. And when I say that, it's someone may have only had 1 or 2 things that were really important to them on the list. Now I've been asked to select top 3. So now I am adding a third one that may not have been important to me. And then there's the other side of that spectrum of a potential respondent who really felt strong about 4 or 5 different things, but you bound me to 3. So now there's constraints. When you start talking about constraints and then those, it's just the widening the boundaries on an answer, that can create frustration for a user. And that adds time in a questionnaire. And we don't want to add time or frustration in any questionnaires. That hurts the user experience. Then its impact on the insights. Again, this is a bit of a combination of the single selection and the multi-selection. The idea of, speedy delivery service, that was in someone's top 3, but someone else really felt it was as strong as someone else who may have selected it only because they were forced to. Someone else would have liked to have put it in their top 5 and felt more strongly about it. We don't know. We can't have significant confidence in terms of really understanding what's going on behind the motives or people's feelings about these options that we're looking at through this analytical lens. Then that moves us to the world of rank order type questions. And most of us have seen this, and the appeal to this for most businesses or decision makers is that it's going to show winners. The previous options, now when you have single selection, it's an assumed that's the only winner, just number 1. You just don't know any of the other places. And then with the multi-selects, you don't have any idea of who is truly number 1, 2, or 3, and those types of rank orders based on how people responded. So that's why organizations tend to gravitate towards some of these rank order type questions. So we shifted it to please rank the following top 3 options in order of importance to you when you're considering pizza from a restaurant. And then you have a full list of a dozen options listed below, and you can pick and move them into the place that you feel is appropriate. The prevailing issues are pretty similar to what we were talking about before. Now, the rank is some people, again, may feel like there could be a 3 or 4 that are really close, and time is a killer in a survey, so it's going to add some frustration. And it may force some other people to rank something where it was like, well, really, it just comes down to 1 thing for me, or it just comes down to 2 things for me. But now I have to pick another thing to add to the list. And that can create a potential false positive on the other side, on the analytics. So again, the respondents, they can't, the other problem with the rank orders is they can't express how they actually feel in terms of what degree that looks like, how strongly they feel about those different things they selected. You already heard me touch on the analysis side a little bit. Now, what's unique about rank order is it gives the perception that I can analyze it multiple ways. Now, in the top 3 example that we give here, you can see that we could analyze it through the lens of percent that selected those options in the top 3 at all. We could analyze it through the lens of percent that selected number 1, percent that selected number 2, percent that selected number 3. We could look at it all those different ways. In this example, it's just percent that selected it all. We can also look at what the average rank was as well, which is the chart to the right where the bars go the opposite direction. So it gives that perception we can analyze it multiple ways. But the truth is this is more compounding in terms of the questions it presents as a result, because all those issues I talked about before are as prevalent as what we were talking about with the multi-select and the single select. There's a combination of constraints on the user, and then it's a little too broad for others in terms of forcing me to pick something I may not have wanted to pick. It also, when you talk about rank order type questions, in the data, it assumes that each rank has equal distance between them. So when I see 1, 2, and 3, I assume the distance between 2 and 3 is the same as the distance between 3 and 2. But we have no idea because you asked us to just rank them. You didn't ask us to rate them. So we know how the race ends. We just don't know the distance between the winner and the silver medalist in this instance. So when you start doing analysis through these percentage that, that actually selected it in the ranking, you have to give it context. A good example you can see down here is that only 20% selected, or excuse me, only 13% only selected gluten-free options. And it was one of the lower ones, but it actually had the highest average rating in terms of a rank that we see over to the right. So as of the few that did select it, it was really important to them. But again, it presents a lot of other analytical issues. It just has this compound effect. Well, then that moves people to, well, don't do top 3. Why don't you rank order everything? And this is interesting because you get to see the full results to the race in terms of rank order. But again, you don't know the distance between first place all the way through the number of different things that you're ranking. So the example here, I'm allowed to rank everything from top to bottom. But the biggest prevailing issues from the user experience are things I touched on earlier. It's really about now you're forcing me to sort of give some credibility to all these options that you've had in here, and I'm going to rank order them. And there may have been some things that were not important to me at all, and now I'm ranking them. And my cutoff could have been around 6. So my remaining 3 or 4 may not have been important to me at all, but I ranked them. And now the analysis is going to show that I ascribe some value to them based on rank order. It also just applies that, it implies that, again, the rank order is this is what really matters to people. Again, there may have only been 2 or 3 things that matter to some. For others, there may have been, in reality, it's just like none of these things may have been important to anyone. Or some users that are taking a survey, but that assumed number 1 means it's really important to me. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the implications on the insights because it only makes things worse than what we saw in the top 3, because we've just widened it to the entire list that we have on the question. Yes, I can look at the average ranking from top to bottom, but again, all those other issues of forcing people to select things that creates ambiguity in the results. That moves us to another question type, the traditional Likert scale. And I know the Likert scale was it was invented in 1932, and it's been used for a long time. And it seems like a tried and true approach. But the truth is not all scales are equal. So we'll show you what the advantages and then some of the potential challenges are with a traditional Likert scale. Now we move the question to how important is it to you that the pizza options you're considering from a restaurant offer the following? And when you're looking at it, it's now I'm at least given the option to rate everything. It's whether or not it's important to me or it's extremely important to me on a scale of 1 to 5. So on the positive, it's more effective in capturing consumer sentiment than the previous examples. I have a sense of where things fall. Part of the problems, though, that start to prop up on the traditional Likert scale is actually the scale size. And you can see in the example that we have on the screen here, when you have a 1 to 5 scale, it's pretty limiting. It's sort of a 4 or 5. That's a big leap from one to the other. It's not that far from the middle of 3. There's only 2 points away. So it doesn't really capture nuances in my potential decisions. And then if you use a radial point approach like this on a survey, it can become overwhelming if you have a lot of different elements on the page as well. We call it a bingo or a battleship effect, basically where people are hunting and finding the element that they're rating and looking for in terms of where it is on the number scale. And we're going to touch on some best practices in the back of this webinar that speak specifically to maximizing scale value. So what happens analytically when we have a scale? One of the biggest prevailing issues I have seen in my years of people implementing 1 to 5 scales is the tendency to want to analyze through the lens of the numbers that are available. The example that we have below here is conducted through the lens of the percentage of respondents that selected a 4 or 5 on that scale of 1 to 5. Now, the biggest problem with doing this type of analysis is it's not accounting for the entire scale. If you're only analyzing those that scored a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, you're only looking at 20% of the scale. If you're looking at it through this lens, 4 or 5, you're only looking at 40% of the scale. You're ignoring 60% of the scale. There may be more to it that's going on in the analysis. And this is what we call an arbitrary categorization analysis. It's just basically randomly picking, in a sense, or grouping or creating cutoffs in the data and analyzing it in those pockets. So our recommendation is to analyze it through the lens of averages. This way, if you're looking at the average score, it captures the entire length of the scale that we're looking at. It doesn't ignore 60% or 80% of the scale. You're looking at 100% of the scale from all the respondents. That's our biggest recommendation. But again, there's some constraints with having a smaller number on that scale. So lastly, we're going to touch on a visual sliding anchor scale. It's essentially now widening the range of the numbers that we're going to use on the scale, but also introducing a visual element. So in this example, we have a visual slider. It's the same exact question as the traditional 1 to 5 Likert scale. We happen to be using a 0 to 100 scale. We presented the number on the scale to the respondents here. But as a respondent, the biggest advantages are, one, it eliminates that overwhelming nature of those radial points that you can see on the screen. It also empowers respondents to rate things based on their visual cues. And when I say visual cues, there's more of a gut response. I'm not obsessing over specific numbers on a scale that are 1 to 5. It's really about moving that visual anchor scale around. And that relieves that stress that can come with some of those radial points. Simplifies the experience, and then it reduces the time that respondents spend on questions like this. Analytically, it's obvious, when you look at the average scores, it's captured that nuance, especially if you're using something like a 0 to 100 scale in this instance. So the advantage is obviously more granular at the respondent level, which bubbles up to greater analysis at the larger top line level of everything that you collected. Having a larger scale actually helps to reduce the desire for some organizations to want to do that arbitrary categorization, where you're going to select, let's look at the percent that selected a 90 or higher. It's just some are probably going to consider it, but now that the scale is wider, we can't look at a single point, that's for sure. It'd be too specific. But it definitely encourages using average analysis. So what are our recommendations for maximizing scale value? It really comes down to those two things that we touched on at the beginning of this follow-up in part 2 of this webinar series. And that's about the user experience, and it's about maximizing your analytical output. So one, it's the number range. Always use a number range that cannot be misinterpreted. And when I say that, it's with a traditional Likert scale, like 1 to 5, you'll even see 1 to 7s, 1 to 9s, 1 to 10s. If you're using a 1 to anything scale, there is a chance that people can misinterpret the 1 as being the best. And that's a misinterpretation that you don't want. And usually the lower numbers are ascribed to something that is lower or a negative sort of perception. And we don't want that potential for misinterpretation. Having a 0 at the extreme of the negative end is clear. It's null, it's void. If it's 0, it's not good. It's not going to be mixed up with what you could have with a number 1. We're also recommending using odd numbered scales. Now, some researchers will say use an even numbered where there's no midpoint so that they can determine if consumers feel one way or the other, and there's no potential for neutrality or something to select right in the middle. I would highly disagree with that approach, because that's the same as doing any forced selection approach that we saw in some of those other question types. And with that, people feel neutral about things. Sometimes people don't feel one way or the other, and it's okay. I would say it's better to know than to force people to select something that is not based in reality. Because in reality, I can walk away from choices. And we need those options in questions as well. You're also going to want to limit the content that you're using in the answers. Now, if you're using smaller scales, people tend to want to have a descriptor for every point on that scale. Something like somewhat, fairly, very. The problem with those is it adds more work to, or it creates an even greater bingo or battleship effect, gaming effect. But those descriptions can also be very subjective based on the individual respondent in terms of how they interpret it somewhat or fairly. And the same goes for the analyst in terms of someone who's analyzing that data, how they are interpreting those same terms. There's too much subjectivity to those. Also with the anchor descriptions, when you have a larger scale, just label the two ends. Once in a while, you may have to label the midpoint in terms of neutrality or unsure, but then it limits the amount of content that you have on that page. Always be simple, clear, and direct. Again, you don't want ambiguity or misinterpretation. When I say that, use extremes. It's either not at all important or extremely important. I don't agree at all. I completely agree. When you have one end of the scale that says not at all important and the other end that says very important, very doesn't take it all the way to the other end. I don't feel that way, or I am extreme about it. Very just seems to fall short a little bit. I worry about that in the analysis. Use visual sliding anchor scales. Again, humans, their consumption and the way that they interact with things is primarily through vision. In fact, I know there's research out there that says somewhere between 80% or more of cognitive interpretation is done through vision. So these visual cues help to reduce time spent on questions. And when you talk about scales, it's about evolving as well. You heard me touch on the Likert scale, invented in 1932. It's a scale that's been used for a long time, but as is with technology, research should evolve as well. And when we look at the two examples, you heard me touch on it earlier, the ability to capture nuances, it's not there with a smaller numbered scale. It's sort of, again, there's a forced element in there. It's just, well, I didn't feel that strongly, but I guess I'll give it a 5. Whereas if you're given a larger visual anchor scale, it can capture all those nuances. It's the difference between basically operating in an 8-bit world versus something that's closer to a high definition world. And you can see it in the data itself. This chart shows an individual's responses that you saw on this last slide. And it's showing 2 axes where it's the scale 1 to 5, 1 at the bottom, 5 at the top, and then the other one 0 to 100. So it's 100 is equal to 5, 0 is equal to 1, 50 is equal to 3. And you can see the differences of the nuances that get captured analytically. It's, you got one instance for the 1 to 5 scale where I'm forced to select 3 things as a 5, when in reality it may have been a 97, 90, and 88 that were really what I was looking for in my answers. So again, we go back to the 3 keys working together. You can see we focused a lot on the user experience and the actionable insights, but those both impact creating a positive brand experience and giving the data you need to have a positive impact on your brand strategy decisions as well. That concludes the specifics in this session. And we've got continued web series that are going to touch on the specifics, the 100 different things that we found, pitfalls. We're going to show examples, problems, solutions, all tied to these themes that we have here. We're going to continue with those, but we're also going to touch on other marketing topics. We've gotten the question type tied to customer sentiment done today, but we're also going to hit on things tied to customer segmentation, geographic analyses, focus groups, gap analyses, quadrant analyses, communications testing. We'll even touch on things like generational targeting and their implications. And we want you to be reassured, these analytical approaches, especially when you start talking about scales, it's not that we're saying don't use single selection, multi-selection, rank order type questions. Those have their places. Single selection, I either have that or I don't have it. I either am that type of person or I am not. I can own all these different types of things in my household. But when it comes to the feelings and the sentiment, that's where we start talking about things like scales have better impact in terms of the interpretive analysis that you get and providing a better user experience. And this stuff is peer reviewed when we start talking about the value of scales and analysis as well. That's the conclusion of today's session. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly through our website at craniumtap.com or email us directly at the email provided here. Or if you have a representative directly working with our parent organization, feel free to reach out to them directly as well. Thanks again for your time today.